Thank you very much, Peter, for your kind and generous introduction. Unfortunately, my Slovakian is not good enough to know what he actually said, but I can make an educated guess, and I hope you'll tell me later if he said something that was not nice. It's really wonderful to be here with you tonight. It's actually wonderful to be just about anywhere with anybody in a setting like this, because things have been so unusual, obviously, over the last, 18, 20 months. I used to make it to Europe several times per year, but this is my first trip abroad since April of 2020. And you know what happened around that time, so it's wonderful to be back as part of the international community, especially to speak on a subject that is very important to me and something that I love to talk about, namely entrepreneurship and innovation, and in particular, the distinction, as you can see by my title, between entrepreneurs and bureaucrats in how they guide, shape, and impact the innovative process. I don't need to spend a lot of time nowadays to explain or motivate why we would be interested in talking about something like entrepreneurship or innovation, right? We live in an era in which entrepreneurs around the world are celebrated, are famous, right? You can find, I haven't been to a bookshop here in Bratislava, but if the bookshops here are like the bookshops in every other country, there are hundreds and hundreds of books about how to be an entrepreneur, how to succeed in entrepreneurship, why entrepreneurship is important. I don't know if do you have a Slovakian version of Shark Tank? So the original Shark Tank is a television show. I'm sure you've seen it or you've seen clips where people pitch their business ideas to actual business angels. There's many different versions now of this format that have spread across the globe. But when I teach entrepreneurship at my university, all the students have seen Shark Tank, and they have an idea of what they think it means to have a business idea and then make a pitch to potential supporters of that idea. Of course, what they've seen is the Hollywood version or the reality TV version, which is sometimes slightly different from actual reality. But it's worth mentioning that we do have many courses and lectures and programs at the university. This is a picture of the Student Entrepreneurship Club at Baylor University, where I teach. We have, besides a student club, we have a student business incubator, we have a student venture competition, sort of like a Shark Tank. We have a community entrepreneurship program. We have a university-sponsored angel investment network, and a whole host of programs and activities around entrepreneurship. We have a major. You can major at the university in entrepreneurship. You can even get a doctoral degree in entrepreneurship studies at Baylor University. When I was a student, there was no such thing. There were no courses in entrepreneurship, and there were certainly no degrees in entrepreneurship. But now it's very much a hot topic. And even if you travel to the far reaches of the globe, especially countries that have a low standard of living, you increasingly hear the claim that the way to improve the standard of living in poor countries is not through government agencies and large investment projects. It's not the World Bank coming in and building dams and hydroelectric power stations and airports. That was the old development model. Now the idea is you need institutions and policies that allow entrepreneurs to flourish, to create companies, to grow companies in all parts of the world. Apparently, if you want to be an astronaut, which is something I wanted to be when I was a little boy, the best way to be an astronaut now is not to work for NASA or the, I don't know, what do they call the Russian space program now, but to be a successful entrepreneur. they're all competing now to see who can get into space first. I think Elon Musk's group his project already sent up a civilian crew last week, first ever civilian crew to reach orbit. I guess his is called SpaceX. Actually, just you might, as an aside, the SpaceX facility where they test the rocket engines before they're used for launch, they go through a testing procedure. The installation where SpaceX tests its rockets is about 10 kilometers from my house. And if you've ever been through an earthquake, and you know what an earthquake feels like and sounds like, that's how it sounds, 2 or 3 times a week when they're testing the new rocket. Apparently people in the community complained about the noise, and they can only test during certain hours and on certain days. Otherwise, they must pay a large fine. But I think Elon Musk can pay the fine many times over without even thinking about it. Here's another reference for the older people in the crowd. I see a few older people in the crowd like me. When I was a teenager, all the boys wanted to be the next Jimmy Page. You know who Jimmy Page is? Young kids, you know who Jimmy Page is? He was the guitarist for Led Zeppelin. But now everybody wants to be the next Larry Page. Okay, so we've gone from Jimmy Page as the hero to Larry Page. The serious point is, if you ask young people all around the world, what do you want to be when you grow up? Many of them will say, I want to be the next Steve Jobs. I want to be the next Elon Musk, the next Mark Zuckerberg. Again, when I was a kid, you wanted to be a rock and roll singer, or a football hero, or you wanted to be the president, or something like that. Entrepreneurs have a higher standing in society today than they did in years past. Now, I would like to say that the reason entrepreneurship is increasingly important in the media, in political discussions, in the culture, is because finally people have rediscovered and learned to appreciate the great treatises in the Austrian School of Economics and related work, for example, Frank Knight's book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. If you look at the history of economic thought, many of the great works, for example, Schumpeter's theory of economic development, Knight's book on uncertainty and the firm, Ludwig von Mises's Human Action, Israel Kirzner's book, which was mentioned by Peter in the introduction, all of these books place the entrepreneur at the front and center, at the heart of the market and entrepreneurial process. As we'll see in just a few moments, most of the economics profession went in a different direction and lost many of the insights of these great writers. Now, these insights also appear in some more recent books by some writers who are, well, just as great, I'm sure you'll admit, as the ones I mentioned before, but maybe not quite so famous. But I think the real reason that people are talking about entrepreneurship today, more than in the past, is because of this. It's because of technology. Right? Everybody knows that, that miraculous device that you carry in your pocket that is more powerful than the most powerful computers of previous generations. Almost everybody knows that these devices did not just appear by magic, and it wasn't the state that produced them. It wasn't some government lab, it wasn't the Ministry of Communications that produced all of these technological devices, personal computers, mobile phones, of course, all of the internet search, Google search and so forth, ride sharing, the list goes on and on of technological innovations that have made our lives much easier in many ways. Now, there may be a dark side to some of these innovations. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But no one would deny that a lot of value to society, value to consumers, value to humanity has been created by technological innovation. And that technological innovation came from entrepreneurs. It came from the bottom up, from the market, not from the top down. It was not bureaucrats or elected officials or politicians or judges or other parts of the state apparatus who gave us these marvelous innovations. It was entrepreneurs. And they are truly marvelous. Not only, because of all the fun things you can do with the device, but I'm sure you've seen data on conditions and living standards around the world. And one of the most remarkable things, I think I skipped I'm sorry, I actually skipped a picture. The first picture I meant to have, I've lost it in my slides, was increases in GDP per capita. You've probably seen a picture like that. It's quite remarkable because if you look at estimates of GDP per capita going back to ancient times, if you could plot GDP per capita for the world, starting here at the birth of Christ, it basically looks like this. Throughout almost all of the last 2,000 years. Then you get to about 1830, 1840, 1850, it starts to go like this. And then it shoots up. It's an absolutely remarkable picture. Sometimes you see pictures like this, they call it a hockey stick graph. Have you heard that term, the hockey stick? It really goes like this and then it zooms up. So we live in an era today, right, in which continuous improvement is expected. And we're disappointed if GDP is only a tiny bit higher this year than it was last year. The younger people in the crowd will appreciate this. When you get a new phone, right, or they announce, Apple announces, what are they up to now? iPhone 13, 14. They announce the next iPhone, and you're eagerly looking at the specs. How many more megapixels does it have? How much of a better camera? How much more memory? How much faster? What are the new features? And people look at it and say, no, it's really not that much better than the last one. I'm so disappointed. Through most of human history, the tools and technology that people have never got better. From one generation to the next generation to the next. The tools that you used on the farm were the same as the tools your father used and the same as the tools your grandfather used and so forth. Of course, there was some technological improvement to be sure, but nothing like the rate of change that we all expect to see today. That comes from new technology driven by entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial market capitalism. Right, this is a picture of, if you look at poverty, how poverty rates have declined around the world since around, in particular, sharp decline over about the last 100 years. A lot of this, of course, as you know, is driven by certain countries, not the US, not Slovakia, but China and India. So rates of poverty have fallen very rapidly in China and India compared to what they were before. You can look at measures of life expectancy. However you want to examine the data, there is no doubt that global conditions over the last 100, 150 years have gotten substantially better. Have you ever seen this picture before? It's one of my favorite classroom illustrations of the advantage of markets and capitalism and entrepreneurship. Right? This is the Korean Peninsula at night, and you see the line down the middle, right above the, 43rd parallel is communist North Korea. Everything shuts down at night. Below the line where you have capitalist South Korea, you have a thriving industrial society where people have electricity at night. What is so interesting about this comparison is, many times if you compare country X to country Y, and country X has a more market-based system country Y has a more state-based or socialist system, it's sometimes hard to make the comparison and to attribute any differences to the economic and political system. Because you also have differences in history, differences in culture, differences in the weather, differences in the history, you know, all sorts of things about country X and country Y. But not here, right? Same culture, same history, same language, same religion, same. Only one difference: communism, capitalism. It's a very stark reminder of how important these issues can be. So, what is the theory that explains why you have different conditions in North Korea and South Korea? Why the standard of living is much higher today in many parts of the world than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Well, the explanation that most of the scientific literature will support or will agree upon is the idea that really ultimately what you need is a certain set of institutions that support the creation of markets and trade and entrepreneurship and innovation. These institutions being things like property rights, protection against expropriation of your property from other private actors and from the sovereign, from the state, right? A system based on the rule of law. Yeah, I guess we have the expression in English, the rule of law, not the rule of men. I'm sure you have the same thing here. A system of transparent rules. Hayek called them purpose-independent rules that apply to everyone in society, no matter their social position or social standing, and a system based on free trade, free markets, and so forth. So these good institutions give you entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship thrives under conditions of protection of property rights, the rule of law, and free markets or economic freedom. Right? Now, of course, we don't mean that every entrepreneurial venture will be successful, because of course many are not. What we mean is that entrepreneurship and the process of competition among entrepreneurs yields tremendous economic and societal benefit in terms of products, services, industries, technologies, etc. Entrepreneurship gives us innovation. All that new stuff, new ways of producing, new ways of organizing, new gadgets, new technologies. These come from the efforts of entrepreneurs competing against each other to make money. Right? How do you make money in this kind of system? By producing goods and services that other people want to buy. In other words, by creating economic value. And then from innovation, you get economic growth, you get improvements in the standard of living, you get decreases in poverty, and so forth, the things that we were discussing on the previous pictures. Okay, this is not at all a controversial model among people who study institutions, entrepreneurship, innovation, and economic growth. There are many disagreements among scholars and policy experts and so forth about some of the details. But I don't think anyone really questions this basic model, or at least they didn't until recently. Let me digress for just a moment, since my talk is mainly about innovation, to tell you what I mean by innovation. What is innovation? What does it mean to innovate? I want to start by emphasizing that innovation in this context is an economic concept, not an engineering concept. So to an engineer, an innovation is a new thing. What we mean by innovation in an economic context is a new thing that creates value to the consumer. Right? So, shoes with umbrellas on them are not really innovations. You could call them inventions, if you like. I don't know how that translates into Slovakian. Invention is like a new gadget. An innovation is something new that creates economic value, that is desired by consumers. There are lots of funny websites you can go to where I got these examples, right? useless inventions. So let's keep in mind, this will be important for later in the talk, that we're not talking about just any new thing. We're talking about a new thing that is desired by the market, that is desired by consumers, something that consumers are willing to pay for because they feel like it makes their lives better. This is Joseph Schumpeter, the famous Austrian economist, your neighbor just across the river. Actually, Schumpeter was not born in Austria. I think he was born, does anyone remember? Was he born in Vienna? I think he was born in the countryside somewhere. But he studied at the University of Vienna with the great Austrian economist Baumbacher. He was a classmate of Mises in Baumbacher's seminar. And Schumpeter, of course, went on to be one of the most famous social scientists of the 20th century. But he's best known for his idea of creative destruction. You heard that word before, creative destruction. The idea that that innovations not only create new firms and industries and so forth, but can also sweep away some of the old ones. Schumpeter is also famous for defining innovation according to these 5 types. So innovation includes introducing a new thing, right? A new economic good or a new quality of a good, but it's not only that, right? It can also refer to introducing a new way of producing an existing good, a new method of production. That's also a kind of innovation. Opening a new market can be an innovation. Creating a new source of supply, reorganizing an industry. So think about, someone like Henry Ford. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. There were others who came before him, including, the German Karl Benz. And, many others had developed a self-propelled vehicle, horseless carriage without horse, as they called it. But Henry Ford figured out a way to mass produce them using the assembly line technology, where each worker specializes in a particular stage of the process, and you get more total production that way, right, than each worker trying to produce an entire automobile by himself. So again, it wasn't a new product, it's kind of a new way of making a product and a new way of organizing the industry to make that product. So these are all kinds of innovations that are important. Why do we care? Schumpeter also pointed out that, look, everyone talks about competition. It's important that we have competition in our economy. We want firms to compete. Businesses want to win the competition against their rivals. Schumpeter pointed out the most important form of competition empirically, it's not really competition on price. That's how we often think of it. I'm selling one of these, and Peter brings one to the market and he sells it for, €1 less than mine. I have to respond, I have to drop my price and so forth. Yeah, that certainly is a kind of competition. But Schumpeter said that the kind of competition that matters the most is competition in innovation. Competition to introduce a new kind of product or service, or a new way of making an existing product or service, and so forth. Okay. This is a major source of competitive advantage for businesses today, as it has been, for centuries. You can outperform your rivals if you can out-innovate your rivals. And of course, innovation in the economic sense is, a key driver or the key driver of economic growth. There's a lot of very interesting literature on the details of the innovative process. And we can discuss more of these details during the question and answer session if you're interested. For example, a famous historian of technology named Everett Rogers pointed out that new technologies typically diffuse or spread throughout an economy or a society according to a predictable pattern. So if you think about from your own experience when a new device is introduced, right, say, it It could be, I don't know, the smartphone, or what would be something more recent, like a ride-sharing app. You guys all use Bolt, or we use Uber and Lyft around different countries have a version of a ride-sharing app. You all know what I mean, right? So when these things are first introduced, not many people use them. Most people prefer to get a taxi the traditional way. They don't really know how this app works. It's a little bit strange. Not many people they know are using it. So you get a few early adopters, but not many. Then all of a sudden there reaches sort of a takeoff point where adoption becomes very rapid. Now all of a sudden everybody's using this new thing. And then you reach a point where adoption, new users kind of tapers off. It kind of stops. So probably today, in September of 2021, if there's anybody out here in the room who does not have a smartphone and does not use a ride-sharing app, you probably are never going to use one. Okay, you've already decided you don't like that. You like to do things the traditional way. Rogers pointed out that many, many new technologies are adopted following the same pattern. Slow early adoption, then rapid mass adoption, and then just a few late adopters. If you draw a diagram of cumulative number of users of a different technology, it looks like a letter S. It looks like this. So he called it the S-curve. You hear people talking about the S-curve for the adoption of new technology. So what makes the S-curve steeper, meaning adoption is more rapid? What makes it flatter? Networking plays a big role here. As you know from social media and social networking apps, right? I mean, I'd never heard of TikTok until, I don't know, a couple years ago. Now it's the fastest growing social media app. Facebook and Twitter do not have a lot of new users because everybody who wants to use them is pretty much already using them. But sometimes a new technology can go from you've never heard of it to everybody's talking about it in the space of days, weeks, months. Another famous contribution to the study of innovation comes from a very well-known business professor who died just a couple of years ago named Clayton Christensen. He taught at Harvard Business School for many years, and he introduced the concept in his famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma. Maybe some of you have read it. He made the argument that radical innovation is very difficult for successful incumbent firms. That radical, or what he called disruptive innovations, those that change the whole structure of the industry, are more likely to come from new firms, from outside firms. Look at examples. Companies that have revolutionized the way we consume television and movies are companies like Netflix, right? A startup company. It was not, some of you watch Disney thing, you have Disney Plus on your phone, you watch Star Wars and all that through the Disney app, right? Disney was very late to that game. It was Netflix and Hulu and a few others that came up with the streaming model. Then it was later adopted by the big Hollywood studios, etc. Many, many examples of digital music. The digital music business, the way to share and distribute digital music files in a way that could earn money for artists as well as distributors. It was not invented by any of the music companies. It was not the studio recording industry. It was not the big record companies, the ones that signed the Beatles or whatever, Capitol Records. It was Apple, which was not a tiny company at that time, but was a complete outsider to the music business. So Christensen argued that when companies become successful, they can be rather complacent, and they tend to focus on satisfying their prestige customers who want a certain kind of high-end product, and they leave openings at the lower end of the market for new entrants to come in who produce something that is simpler, cheaper, more modular, more reliable, and often this causes the successful incumbent companies to fail, to be disrupted. One of my friends from graduate school, Henry Chesbrough, has written a lot about what he calls open innovation, which is the idea that innovation often takes place in, sort of collaborations among companies when they open up their processes using common standards and interfaces and sort of open specs. Classic example of that would be like open source software or Wikipedia, right? Wikipedia is an open source encyclopedia that is produced by a collaboration among millions and millions of writers and editors. There are also smaller scale examples where for-profit companies are collaborating with other for-profit companies using standards and technologies that are open and shared among the participants rather than being kept closed and proprietary. So we know a lot about different aspects of innovation, how innovation works, what are some of the challenges to companies that are trying to innovate, and so forth. One thing that we all know, or at least I thought we all knew, is that the sort of Soviet-style, top-down, state-run model for innovation is crazy. Nobody could think that this could possibly work, especially those, like you, who have been through a period in your country's history where you were under the influence of this kind of central planning model. You're not going to get the iPhone from Gosplan. You're not going to get, whatever. Think of whatever technology you like or want. These technologies don't come from top-down, state-led central planning. Even when I was a student, 80s, 90s, it seemed that everybody knew this. And then the collapse of socialism starting in 1989 seemed to confirm to all reasonable observers that this model of heavy state-run or even state-led technology development is not a feasible model. This is just not a model that works. Well, surprise, surprise, this model is making a comeback. Within the last 2, 3, 4 years, we're seeing a surge of interest in, I don't know what you call it exactly, neo-socialism or a call for a return to a strong role of the state, if there ever was one, in directing innovation in particular. Probably the best-known spokesperson for this new movement is the Italian economist Mariana Mazzucato, who teaches at the University of Sussex in the UK. She wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State a few years ago, which argued, contrary to people like me, we'll get into the argument in just a second, that the iPhone and all of these wonderful things, they didn't come from entrepreneurs primarily. They didn't come from markets, they came from the state, by which she means the state created the basic underlying technology of the internet and GPS and the transistor and so forth. And then private entrepreneurs just kind of copied or took advantage of, or how do you say it, piggybacked on top of, rode on the back of the state. It's really the state that deserves the credit. And her latest book, called The Mission-Driven Economy, is a call for a return to old-style industrial planning. We have started to see articles about the role of the state in the internet. Even Obama weighed in a few years ago, saying, yeah, it's really the government should get credit for the internet. And while government did not invent Facebook and Twitter would not have been possible if it were not for the government. You hear people talk about Sputnik moments. You all know, what Sputnik means to an American. To an American, Sputnik, this is before my time, I wasn't born yet, but supposedly when the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite, it was a shock to the Americans because they thought that they were far ahead of the Soviets in technology. And the fact that the Soviets beat the Americans to launching a satellite was sort of an awakening. And so it led to a huge increase.
In year 67 or 58.
Yeah. So it led to
I was a young man.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as a result of Sputnik, right, you saw a huge increase in U.S. government spending on innovation and technology. The other term you often hear for this is a moonshot. So President Kennedy in 1960 said, we must put a man on the moon by the end of this decade. And the Americans did it in, 68? Right? So the idea that 69, this is the argument. The free market could not have put a man on the moon. You need the government running a giant program to spend all the money and marshal all the resources to get a really big, great project. You hear people today say we need another moonshot, by which they mean another huge, extremely expensive scientific program that the government will fund and the government will sponsor. So there's a news magazine called Boston Review that just this week has a new forum on industrial, here they're calling it industrial policy, but yeah, industrial policy, like industrial planning, where the state chooses which industries are the best industries and supports them. So like I said, I thought these arguments were dead and buried, but now they're making a comeback. Why? Why are they making a comeback? Well, the kind of argument that you hear is something like the following. People say that bureaucrats, and here I'm using the word bureaucrat broadly to mean state functionaries, state officials, not just the mid-level bureaucrat.
State administration.
Yeah, and anyone in the state administration. What role do they play in bringing about entrepreneurship and innovation? Well, one argument you hear is that the free market and entrepreneurs are very good at applications, at applied science and technology, but not in basic science. You need the state, to fund the basic research in physics and chemistry and astronomy that no commercial company would fund, but is nonetheless important for later developments to follow. Second argument you hear is that you need the state to push or shift technological development into an area that has a high societal benefit, but maybe is not commercially valuable, like green energy. So even if the argument is, even if green energy is not as efficient right now as coal or nuclear or some kind of non-renewable form of energy, we need to push the market to go in that direction because it will be better for climate change, even if it's not profitable. Third argument we hear is that government needs to provide subsidies, financial support, other kinds of support for small companies, especially in the technology sector. It needs to subsidize technology startups and other small firms. Or you hear the argument, and just to give you a little preview of the results, this is the argument that I think is most correct, that the proper role of bureaucrats or the state or the government administration is to try to promote an environment in which entrepreneurship can flourish without picking the specific entrepreneurs, specific firms, or specific technologies that will win, without picking the winners. So let me just explore a couple of these arguments in a little bit more detail and show you some problems with the argument, and then we'll stop and take some questions, okay? So the usual argument for government funding of science and basic research is that scientific research is what mainstream economists call a public good, meaning it provides benefits even to those who do not directly produce it. Right? If you discover a new mathematical theorem, that could provide benefits to people all around the world as they apply your theorem to make technologies or something. And there's no way you can charge everybody a fee for the right to use your theorem. Because scientists, after all, publish their research in books and articles, and it's available for anybody to read, very basic science. Therefore, private actors, the argument goes, will not spend enough money on basic scientific discovery, because you can't make money inventing something really, really basic. The usual argument for this is a kind of empirical, the usual empirical argument is what I call a laundry list. I don't know if you have this expression here, just kind of like a random list of things that don't go together. So typically people will point to specific technologies that were in fact supported in some way by the state and later turned out to have some commercial application. So usual example is, modern example is during wartime. So out of World War I, spending especially by the Americans, the British, and others in the West, led to things like manufacturing penicillin. The research on poison gas led to some positive developments like sprays, hairspray and body spray and so forth. In World War II, of course, we saw the development by the military of lots of important technologies: atomic energy, sonar, the jet engine, a lot of advances in logistics and distribution, procurement and so forth. And of course the Cold War brought us the first digital computer, which was a US government project. GPS, the internet. Tang is when I was a kid, it's a drink. It's like an orange powder. You mix it with water and it makes a really bad tasting kind of fake orange juice. And what I was told as a kid was, well, this is what the astronauts drink up there on their rocket ship. So kids wanted to drink it. Apparently, it turns out Tang was not invented by NASA, but it's often given as a sort of silly example of something invented by NASA that later turned out to be useful. I mean, it certainly is true in the history of the internet that a lot of the underlying internet technology was developed by government agencies like CERN, the laboratory in Switzerland, which is a publicly financed technology lab. The very first web browser was called Mosaic, and it was developed by the University of Illinois, a publicly funded research university. That's the technology that later became Mozilla. So if you use Firefox as your browser, you're using the basic technology created by Mosaic. Okay, so that proves that it's good when government spends money to develop things like web browsers and jet engines and computers, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. There are some problems with this argument, as I'll show you. First, let me just remind you a point that was made earlier. What we're really interested in is economic innovation, not purely technological innovation. So a lot of military technologies did not, in fact, have civilian uses, and a lot of things that came out of NASA or DARPA, you may have heard of, was Cold War U.S. government agency that did the research on the internet. I mean, DARPA spent billions and billions, maybe trillions of US dollars on projects, one of which turned out to be really good, TCP/IP. But most of the DARPA projects, of course, were failures. A very interesting argument, which oddly enough was made by an economist named Austin Goolsbee, who later became chief economic advisor to President Obama. He pointed out, so to put it in technical economics terms, the demand for basic science is inelastic. Sorry, the supply of scientific effort is inelastic with respect to the funding amount and source. What does that mean? Imagine you are a professor at Harvard University and you're studying astrophysics or something like that. If you get a government grant, you can use your government grant to build a telescope or buy a computer or do whatever you do in the lab. What happens if you don't get the government grant?
It's bad.
If you're a famous professor at Harvard University, I mean, they have so much money. You know, they have billions of dollars in the bank in an endowment. They can fund whatever kind of scientific research the professors want, whether they have a government grant or not. In other words, according to Goolsbee, what government science funding really does, it doesn't give you different scientific experiments than the ones we otherwise would have had. It just, one kind of funding substitutes for another. Harvard doesn't have to use its money because the US taxpayer is providing the money. Actually, what he showed was the main thing he could demonstrate in the statistics, the main impact of government-sponsored scientific research, was not an increase in the amount of scientific research, but rather an increase in the wages of scientific workers. In other words, scientists are going to do the kind of research they want to do. If they can get a government grant, they can use it to pay themselves a little bonus. Right? So you don't get more science, better science, different science. It's just basically a transfer of resources into the pocket of the scientist. There's quite a lot of literature on this point. Also, if you look in more detail at these cases, you find that the true story is almost never the story that is told in the textbooks. There's a wonderful book by a British scientist named Terence Keeley that I would recommend on this topic, and he's got several more recent articles in the book too. For example, one of the stories we hear is that the Allies in particular developed radar during World War II, and sonar also, and that without the military invention of radar, you know, we would not have a commercial aviation industry like we have today. Keeley points out, if you look closely at what was going on, radar had already been invented before the start of World War II. The private civilian aviation industry had already invented radar. The issue was there were competing technologies. There were different versions of radar. And for radar to work, you know, the equipment in the plane has to match the equipment on the ground for the signal to work. So there was an issue about what format would ultimately be adopted as the dominant format for airplanes and ground control stations to use. And they were trying to figure this out. They were sort of competing against each other. The US military comes in and says, we need radar, we're going to use that one. They just picked one of the competing technologies. Not necessarily the best one. They just picked one and said, all airplanes for military use have to use this kind of radar. And so the other technology died, and we ended up with this one particular radar standard that we used after the war. Was it the best radar technology? Maybe not. Right? So the government didn't invent anything, it just grabbed something that the private sector had invented and forced everybody to use it. Okay? You know, final argument is that, look, if the government spends billions of euros or dollars and produces some kind of an invention, what we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of inventions would have been produced if that money had stayed in the hands of the original owners? But if that money comes from taxation, that's money taken out of the private sector. That could also have been used to innovate. And who knows what kind of innovations we would have had. Even in the case of the internet, there were private electronic communication networks from the 1960s and 70s on. Large companies had their own kind of networks. There were some dial-up networks. Some of you old-timers may remember AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe. These things you had to dial up on a telephone and you could connect to a network. It's quite possible that one of those privately developed networks would have evolved into something like the modern internet if DARPA and the US military had not chosen another technology and sort of forced it to become the standard. Okay? So let me just sort of wrap up with a related issue. Suppose we're not talking about major innovations, but just small business in general. You know, restaurants, dry cleaners, small shops, small manufacturing concerns. Is there a role for government in subsidizing those? For example, by giving tax credits or tax credits for small companies, or in the US companies can deduct from their income, taxable income, what they spend on research and development to encourage them to do more of it. You know, we could have policies like that. I'm all in favor of tax reductions for small businesses. Where I differ with some of the experts is I would also like to see tax reductions for large businesses, okay? Something very important that government can do is make it easier to register and launch a new venture. So efforts to reduce the amount of paperwork, to make it simpler, easier, less expensive, and faster to create a new company is something that would certainly help. What about indirect subsidies like the government spending money on technical colleges, building roads and electricity generation and so forth? Well, I mean, yeah, so these things they do seem to be associated with increases in some kinds of entrepreneurial activity. Are they the right ones? We'll see in just a second. And then, of course, there are all kinds of programs of direct government loans and grants to small businesses, technology businesses, setting up government-sponsored research parks where businesses can locate and so forth. There's been a lot of research on subsidies in particular, almost all of it negative. Meaning, almost all of the research, and one of the top scholars in this field is a Harvard professor named Josh Lerner. Most of what these subsidies do is they go to politically connected small firms, not small firms that are actually producing the most value. So there's very little evidence that any of these direct efforts to subsidize particular kind of firms have a desirable effect. And we have a lot of literature on industrial policy more generally, again, finding that it does not increase the rate of economic growth, does not do a good job at picking successful companies. Why? I mean, it's obvious have you heard this term, picking winners? It's very hard for the state to pick winners, especially because the state bureaucrats, unlike the guys on Shark Tank, are not investing their own money. They're investing your money. So they lack the expertise, they lack the strong incentive that you get from an angel investor or a capitalist, a venture capital firm. They're bureaucrats, they're not trained as investors, and they're investing the taxpayers' money. Okay, so let me just skip ahead here. I was going to talk a little bit about, I have something about COVID, but I'll save it for the Q&A period. So, in summary, innovation, economic growth, prosperity, these things are all driven by profit-seeking entrepreneurs competing to create economic and social value. Historically, bureaucrats certainly have played a role in funding, in guiding and trying to direct innovation in particular ways, but the track record of these government programs is very poor. It's very poor. I would argue that the best government policy to promote entrepreneurship and innovation is the same kind of policy that promotes economic well-being in general, by which I mean property rights, the rule of law, sound monetary system, free trade, economic freedom. I sometimes get asked, because I'm an entrepreneurship professor, how many small firms do you think there should be? Or what do you think is the right proportion between small firms and large firms in a healthy economy? My answer is always, whatever proportion of small firms and large firms arises in free market competition. Beyond that, I don't have any preference for one size of firm over another. Whatever emerges from a process of competition among entrepreneurs is the outcome that we want. And it's impossible to specify before that process takes place exactly what that outcome will be. So thank you very much for listening.